Looks like we're trying to figure out if it's a good idea to buy their stock right now or maybe steer clear for a bit.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure.
It's been, well, I guess you could call it a roller coaster year for Micron, right? Up 37%, not too shabby. But then, whoa, down 40% from that high point back in June.
Definitely a wild ride.
So is now the time to jump in and buy low, or is this a sign of bigger issues on the horizon? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, you picked an interesting time for this deep dive. Micron's fourth quarter earnings report, it actually comes out later today.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're talking big news that could really shift things.
Absolutely, those numbers could definitely make waves.
Right, everyone's kind of holding their breath to see what happens after the closing bell today. Analyst predictions, they're saying earnings per share should land around $1.13, with revenue at about $7.64 billion.
Big expectations.
A lot of pressure, for sure. And the stock market, it seems a bit uncertain about Micron right now, wouldn't you say? Closed at $94 yesterday. I mean, it's an increase, but nothing to write home about, at least not yet.
Exactly. It's a bit of a waiting game at this point. This earnings report, it's crucial, really. If Micron manages to surpass those expectations, we could see their stock price climb. But if they fall short,
Uh-oh, not good.
it could get a little turbulent, yeah. And this uncertainty, it's totally understandable. The market is trying to gauge whether Micron is a solid long-term investment.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about those investment possibilities. There's an article, it mentioned that Morgan Stanley analyst Joseph Moore, he's being a little cautious about Micron, gave the stock an equal weight rating. Now, for anyone who might not be familiar with that term, it essentially means he's anticipating Micron's performance to be on par with the overall market.
Right, so not terrible, but not exactly a glowing recommendation either.
Exactly.
An equal weight rating, it's kind of like a hold signal. It suggests that Moore doesn't see Micron significantly outperforming or underperforming in the near future. He also set a $100 price target for the stock, which...
Okay, so that might sound promising, right? I mean, it's higher than its current price.
True, it is higher than where it stands now, but if you compare it to what some other analysts are predicting, it's actually a pretty conservative estimate.
You're right. The article, it also highlighted that the overall analyst consensus is significantly more optimistic. We're talking 24 other analysts here, and their average price target is $151.54. That's...
A considerable difference.
yeah, a potential 61% increase. So the question is, are all these other analysts missing something crucial that Moore sees?
Not necessarily. You see, these analyst ratings, they're just opinions, educated guesses based on their understanding of the market. And those opinions can vary quite a bit, depending on their analysis, their past experiences, even their own personal biases.
So how do we sift through all that?
The key is understanding the why behind the rating, not just blindly following the crowd. Think for yourself.
Which is exactly what we're all about here on the deep dive. So let's delve into some of the factors that analysts are considering, starting with the technical indicators. One of the articles you sent, it had a bunch of charts and graphs, which, let's be honest, can look a bit intimidating.
Oh, absolutely. Technical analysis, it's got its own language.
It really does.
But don't worry, we'll break it down.
Perfect, because one thing that jumped out at me was the article mentioning that Micron is currently trading above its 8-day and 20-day simple moving averages.
SMAs.
Right, SMAs. Sounds complicated, but they're basically like trend lines that smooth out those daily price fluctuations we see with stocks. And the article, it said that when a stock is trading above its short-term SMAs, like Micron is now, it's often seen as a positive sign, potentially indicating a good time to buy, at least for the short term.
That's a great way to put it. Think of those shorter-term moving averages as indicators of immediate momentum. If the stock price is consistently above them, it suggests there's some buying pressure, potentially pushing that price higher.
So that's the short-term outlook. But what about the long game? The article also pointed out that Micron is currently trading below its 50-day and 200-day SMAs. And those longer-term moving averages, they paint a bit of a different picture, don't they?
They do. The 50-day and 200-day SMAs, those are like the veterans of trend lines. They provide a broader sense of the long-term trend. And when a stock dips below those, it could be a sign that the market might be turning bearish, less optimistic about the company's future.
So now we have these mixed signals, short-term momentum versus long-term uncertainty. And to add another layer, the article throws in the MACD. We won't get too technical here, but basically, it's another momentum indicator. And in Micron's case, it's currently flashing a bearish signal.
Exactly. It can get overwhelming when you're just looking at technical analysis. On one hand, you've got short-term indicators hinting at potential gains, but on the other, those longer-term indicators and the MACD, they're painting a more cautious picture.
Like trying to read tea leaves, but instead of tea leaves, it's a bunch of squiggly lines on a chart.
Pretty much. But the key takeaway here is that the market hasn't quite made up its mind about Micron.
So it's up in the air.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means there's opportunity. There are those who are willing to dig a little deeper, do their homework, and form their own conclusions.
So we've covered the technical signals, and it sounds like those are kind of sending mixed messages. But there's this whole other aspect we got to factor in, something that's been generating a lot of buzz lately, artificial intelligence.
Yeah, AI. And this is where things get really fascinating for Micron because AI, it needs a ton of data, right? And where does all that data have to go?
Well, memory, I'd imagine.
Exactly. Lots and lots of memory.
Makes sense. And one of the articles you sent actually called Micron the, quote, best cheap technology stock to buy, specifically because of its potential in the AI space. The argument was that Micron is in a really good position to benefit from that increasing demand for memory chips, the kind that can handle the demands of AI applications.
And it's not just hype. Micron produces DRAM and NAND memory, both of which are absolutely crucial for AI systems.
So what's the difference between those two? I'll admit I'm not entirely clear on that.
Sure, so DRAM, think of that like the brain's short-term memory. It handles the active processing of data, which AI just devours.
It's got to be working overtime.
Oh, yeah. And then you've got NAND, that's more like long-term memory, storing all the data that those AI systems learn from. And get this, Micron is a major player in both those markets.
Wow, okay. So they're covering their bases. The article also mentioned something called high bandwidth memory, HBM. It sounds, I don't know, kind of futuristic, but apparently it's a big deal in the world of AI, right?
It's huge. Imagine like a super highway for data. That's essentially what HBM is. It allows for incredibly fast data transfer speeds.
Which I'm guessing AI desperately needs.
Oh, absolutely. It's exactly what AI applications need to process those massive data sets and to do it all in real time. Wow.
And guess what? Micron is pouring resources into HBM technology. They're not just keeping pace, they're aiming to lead the pack.
That's impressive. So if AI really takes off the way people are predicting, Micron could be sitting pretty comfortably.
They could, but it's not a guaranteed win. The memory market, it's notoriously cyclical. It has its highs and lows.
Right, those ups and downs.
Exactly. Even Micron's CEO has acknowledged that the near future could be a bit bumpy, especially with the DRAM market being a bit sluggish right now.
Right, so that's a factor. And we can't forget cheap. Well, it's relative, right? Even with that recent dip in Micron's stock price, it's not exactly pocket change.
Sure.
Some analysts are still saying it's overpriced, even with the whole AI potential factored in.
That's a valid point. Valuation is always key. But here's something else to consider hedge funds. Ooh, hedge funds. Now we're talking. Big money, high stakes. What's the deal there?
Well, one of those articles pointed out that a lot of hedge funds are buying into Micron right now.
Interesting.
Over 100 of them, which is definitely noteworthy.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And hedge funds, they have a reputation for being pretty sharp investors. They do their research.
They don't mess around.
Exactly. They look for those undervalued opportunities, and they're not afraid to go big.
So are they seeing something that maybe other investors aren't? Is that a vote of confidence for Micron?
It's definitely something to think about. When you have that many hedge funds showing interest in a stock, it's a sign they see some potential there. But keep in mind, even hedge funds, they're not infallible. They don't always get it right.
So not a surefire guarantee, more like another piece of the puzzle as we try to make sense of this whole Micron situation. So it sounds like we got a real head scratcher on our hands with Micron. They've got this huge potential with the whole AI boom, but then there are these short-term concerns with the DRAM market, and some analysts saying their stock is still too expensive. What's an investor to do with all this conflicting information?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no crystal ball, unfortunately. But let's try to connect the dots and see if we can make things a little clearer.
All right, let's break it down. What are the strongest arguments for being optimistic about Micron right now?
The AI angle is undeniably compelling. We're on the cusp of a major technological shift, and Micron is making the right moves to capitalize on it. Their investments in high bandwidth memory, or HBM, are particularly promising. Remember, that's like the superhighway for data that AI applications crave.
And it's not just the technology itself. There's also the potential for a surge in demand driven by those recent interest rate cuts. If companies start investing more heavily in AI, Micron stands to benefit big time.
Exactly. Lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper, which could encourage a wave of investment in cutting-edge technologies like AI. And when companies invest in AI, they need more memory, more storage, and more of everything Micron produces.
Okay, so there's a lot to be excited about on the AI front. But what about those short-term concerns? That DRAM market slowdown seems like a pretty big deal.
It is. The memory market is cyclical. And right now, the DRAM cycle is in a bit of a slump. That means lower prices and potentially lower profits for Micron in the near term. It's something investors definitely need to keep an eye on.
And even with the recent drop in Micron's stock price, some analysts are still saying it's not exactly a bargain.
True, valuation is always a balancing act. But here's the thing about Micron. They're not just riding the AI wave, they're actively shaping it. They're innovating, they're investing, and they're positioning themselves as leaders in the memory space.
So it sounds like Micron is a bit of a high-risk, high-reward kind of investment right now.
That's a fair assessment. There's a lot of potential upside, especially if AI takes off the way many experts predict. But there are also risks, like the cyclical nature of the memory market and the uncertainty surrounding overall economic conditions.
So where does that leave our listener who's trying to decide whether to buy, sell, or hold Micron stock?
Well, instead of giving you a definitive answer, which I can't ethically do, I'm going to leave you with this. Imagine you're standing at a crossroads. One path is well-trodden, familiar, but maybe not all that exciting. The other path is new, unpaved, a bit risky, but with the potential to lead to something extraordinary. Which path would you choose?
That's a powerful image. And on that note, we'll leave our listener to ponder those paths and make their own informed decision. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.